that was a really, really fascinating collection of conversations and sort of explorations as well of architecture. My interests are sort of also overlap with the idea of conversations. I'm interested in conversations that happen in the process of bringing architecture into being, amongst other things, as well as the positions that we take and use technology in the process of doing that. I first came across your work as well, or some of your work via the Living Cities discussions on which on YouTube. And that kind of struck me as a form of, it felt like an academic journal, but in a very different format, which I thought was interesting, and it felt that much of that sort of carried on, has continued in what we see today in the film. In terms of your kind of retention and cultivation of this kind of community of conversations amongst and between scholars, which I thought was quite nice. But the film also touched on your sort of the technical research as well. And so for me, it's interesting to see this sort of body of technical research and scholarly research happening within practice, where typically it's sort of one is in practice and the other one for the university, which I thought was interesting. My question, which is the little trick to articulate, is just sort of if you could say a few words about how you've managed to enable this kind of cohabitation of scholarly and technical research within your practice.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's to me, it's interesting to see it more as a flow, which is one's learning at each twist and turn of the journey through the people who are enabling buildings, so the crafting, the engineering, the materials. But actually, I think that the conversations are also continuous, because if you trail it back, I think there are cycles in schools of architecture where actually building isn't, in my experience, hasn't been the top of the agenda. Thinking big in terms of urban design or city making has often been the key kind of point of focus of the endeavour of students and studios. And then it's turned, so that I'm almost my lineage, when we were at the Royal College and the AA particularly, I think the idea of a detail, or thinking as closely as a material, was kind of completely off the radar. By the time I'd finished, I spent 14 years as a lecturer at Cambridge. I was running a studio, 50th studio, which was really about making one-to-one. And it was using the engineering workshops at Cambridge Engineering Department. And I realized at that point that actually it was just with that flow, one was moving into naturally the process of making buildings. So I'm talking about my own experience, but I think it's true that the cycle of conversation is happening at either that very large scale or the product design scale, that we were dealing with as a studio at Cambridge at the end. And I think it's important to understand the scope of that scale of thinking, which is a wonderful part of architectural education. But at the centre of it is conversation. And I think the extraordinary thing about architecture and architectural practice and education is that the debate never stops. And it's the openness of that has been the heartbeat of life.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I recognise a lot of, Eric, I recognise a lot of what you're saying there in our studios upstairs. So it's to Karen.
Thank you. So my question is really about this sort of language of architecture that I think Leslie was talking about at the beginning of the film, and also related to practice and teaching studio. I run a unit here, a diploma unit here, with 15 people, 50 students, practice of, say, 9 to 10. And we focus a lot on collective learning, and, you know, in both teaching here, sort of doing a lot of research together, drawing, observation, drawings, reference studies. And similar kind of approach can be kind of adopted to practice to a certain extent, and different types of discussions, but ideas are debated and developed together. When I see your practice, I'm sure it's much larger than ours, the number of people, and I'm interested in how do you hold that language together, develop a culture in the office. I assume there's a lot to do with, we saw you drawing at the drawing table, you know, like literally hand drawing and communicating that way. I just want to understand how you do that, how do you, and your projects are varied as well. It's not like there's a standard language that you repeat. So I'm very intrigued how you can do that at that scale.
Okay, well, I think one part of the response would be the thinking about scales of making. And I think that the answer to the first point had a lot to do with that. It's possible to work on larger projects because they are almost being felt at, you know, city scale, and it's possible to focus on critical parts at a closer scale. I think right now this film was about probably things that, yeah, the great minds that spoke are involved with, which is actually the process of teaching at Cambridge, for instance, with Dalrymple, was one about speculation of pretty big social issues. So there was a mental hospital there. You know, we dealt with the issue of justice. We dealt with, through his very clever thinking about reflecting really social situations and thinking about the culture of the context, and beginning to see architecture as a framework rather than a formal end in itself, that is something much more responsive, maybe less precise, not about autonomous buildings, but about buildings that spoke to each other. So I think in both the case of the what you could call the justice quarter of the City of London, which is specifically about cybercrime, finance crime, but the everyday world of justice as well, would be a kind of social narrative that I find myself replaying the conversations in architecture school. So the ability to begin to think about those social agendas and the frameworks that are critical for them. I think the experimentation that's plausible within the School of Architecture is absolutely relevant. For me, that's a sort of 30-year gap, but it finds itself in terms of the thinking process for a larger practice, you know, circa 100, not just architects, but other people. The Salisbury Square project is a project that had 30 architects working on it. But the interesting thing is, and that's where, you know, this kind of work from home thing is really difficult, because actually what you have within a practice, some of us have been working together for 35 years, and it goes down to those who are just joining. And actually, there's also a sort of cycle that's much longer than the 5 years of architectural education, but it's about handing on that process and the thinking process that is absolutely intensely linked to experimentation within the studio school of architecture. So I think that really, it's scaling up, but those underlying principles that you've worked through in terms of strategies for urban thinking, and therefore the context for buildings, rather than, I think it's clear that there was a nice comment in the film about dialogue between buildings. I think it's not just a form of dialogue, but it's the use of the buildings and how they come together to create a place, an urban place, perhaps other territories as well. But the dialogue is set up socially, and it goes beyond the facade to a sort of depth of building. So I guess that there's a scaling up, and that's perfectly plausible, but not without the foundation that I think should be the essential part of architectural education.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that leads really nicely to Morgan, who's also perhaps going to talk about education and architectural learning.
Hi, so I'm a final year student here, and from the film we can see that you have influences from Dalibor as a student. So how do formative learning experiences and influential teachers create lessons that recur or are compounded through architectural education to your life as an architect?
Yeah. I think that I have to say that I've hardly ever worked for an architect, so I don't come out of a formal school. I worked for a year with a very interesting housing association architect in Newcastle my year round. I've done a bit of part-time, but actually my learning has been through the process of teaching. When I taught the third year, I inherited the idea that apart from studio teaching, that actually one was learning from case studies, from the best buildings that were being built, and actually always one historic building. So there were 5 case studies, and architects would come to speak, engineers would come to speak, you'd make a site visit. They were examinable processes in whether it was engineering, whether it was construction, whether it was servicing, really real issues. So you were in the studio, and and speculating freely and openly, but there was this grounding, which I think is so important, which is about measuring, which is about surveying, which is about being in contact at that, at your level, particularly. There's the fascination with what it is to be dealing with stuff as well. So I think I would go back. My learning experience was to see a great project come through the door, and you look and you think, my God, the tolerances in this are really difficult. So the great architects who were very willing to offer the drawings and things for that process of thinking about reality were for me fantastic. That was my education, rather than running through a process of perhaps coming out of a great stable, which I didn't, which may also reflect something in terms of the difference that is part of our practice, which is just a wonderful daily routine having, I think, something like maybe 14 nationalities, maybe more, within our 100 people. That's London. But, it's like the greatest joy is to be able to have the conversations about different cultures and different approaches. So it's very eclectic in that sense. But every project has that architectural particularity that it's unique, a word one uses advisedly because of the place it's built, which is absolute.
Thank you. Fascinating. I think we always say that to our students here at LondonMet. Something very special about studying architecture in London, beyond what we can offer, but actually outside the walls of the university, what you can see and experience. Carolyn?
I think it's a fantastic film. I've seen it about 10 times now. Because I had the pleasure and privilege of doing your job, Claire, at the original screening at the BAFTA, and I sort of had a question prepared, but not really. And I have to say, during the course of the film, I've had 100 questions, any one of which we could now spend 3 hours debating, which we're clearly not going to do because we need to get the drinks. So I think I just want to say what I love about the film, and obviously your work, Eric, makes it possible, and also, as you say, the incredible talking heads that you and Jon assembled, is how astonishingly complex architecture is. And we live in a world where I think everything that you care about and strive to make possible is under threat one way or another. And it came up a little bit in the film, AI, I happen to see as mostly a threat. Clearly, both the forces of capitalism and the imminent collapse of capitalism, the need to work within the constraints of a shrinking world. But most critically, I think, a loss of a sense of the public and the common. And I think one of the things that, having also sort of been taught by Dalibor and indeed taught with him and therefore imbue that astonishing sense of, well, as it was sort of credited in the AA book, which you featured in rather prominently, architecture and continuity. What is that responsibility? How do we, as architects or people who care about it, practice it, learn it, see its value? How do we carry that on through to the next generation? Because I think it's so ephemeral. It is in the difference between drawing by hand and drawing on a computer, the difference between caring about the materials and doing a Trump tower, whatever that is, or let's not even talk about the ballroom. So yes, how do we carry that on? I know you do it intuitively, but how do we jointly and severally carry on and express what really, really matters about creating a space for humans to socialise and be more than the sum of their parts, and in a generous, as you say, in an open way? What's the key?
Yeah, lots, but it's. I think that one aspect is actually in the world that Kenneth was so feeling cynical about. It is possible, actually, I think, for the architect to be a very important part of a bigger picture. So particularly, whether it's two practices working together and finding a proximity and a dialogue between themselves with different buildings around a place, hopefully with a kind of an urban structure that's being understood through the planners, or through town architects, wherever they go. This sort of larger scale thinking, but deprived of that, it's down to us to make out of the projects we have an element that is just to do with generosity and the public spirit. And we can do that. We need the authority, and the defensive authority, and hopefully positively so, of planning. And that's under threat, I think, critically. Sometimes that's really tricky, but on the one hand we need that, and then we need obviously great clients who have a sense of responsibility, because I think it's the first thing that developers or private clients, there is a responsibility to the world beyond the particular building. So I think inculcating that sense of responsibility, but also being able to create it oneself, you know, so that as architects and designers, we're able to join things up which otherwise won't be seen. That's at an urban dimension so important, beyond the form. And so I think, actually, those are all lessons. And if there isn't a foundation of empathy for that attitude built through studios, we're in trouble. So that's why architectural education and the studio within architecture and the conversations about architecture in the schools of architecture is absolutely fundamental as a starting point.
Thank you.
Really interesting to hear some of your reflections on your experience of making the film, of working with an architect and speaking to a whole load more.
I'm going to try doing this without a microphone. The only reason I have I'm a director is because I have a loud voice. But would you prefer me to use this? People at the back, which do you like? Microphone. Okay. I have to tell you that as I sit here, I have a really, really bad case of imposter syndrome. When I think about this panel and when I think about you, I know nothing. And I probably started the film feeling that very acutely. I wasn't sure whether I was going to have to ask Eric a question. And I was thinking, well, what can I ask him? And I suppose I would say, Eric, why the hell did you commission me to make this film? I still haven't got an answer to that after a couple of years. Thinking about what you've all said, and also where I've just come from, which the reason I'm late is not just because I don't want to sit through this film again, but I went to the book launch of a book written by a friend of mine, which is his diaries between 1975 and 1990 of living with the Bushmen people. The Bushmen people of the Kalahari are some of the original mankind. And that then led me to thinking about the word culture. Culture is, of course, a homophone. It has more than one meaning. Eric talked about the culture within his practice. I, some years ago, was asked to make a film which took me to a lecture that was given by a very distinguished professor of organizational behavior at INSEAD, the business school outside Paris. He was of South Asian origin, and he was explaining the importance of culture in an organization. He was talking, of course, about organizational culture as opposed to historical culture. And he put it like this, which actually ties back to what you all do. He said he could go into a building and he could put his finger up, metaphorically, and he could sense what the culture of that institution was like by looking at it. He used the example of Anglo-American, the huge mining corporation with its original headquarters in Johannesburg. And he said you would walk in there and you walk down long, endless corridors with officers coming off it. And that spoke volumes for the kind of organization it was. Or you would walk into Eric's practice, for example, with totally open plan, and with Eric sitting, beavering away at his drawing board in one corner, and a bunch of moles sitting in front of Max elsewhere, but all talking to each other, all interacting. That culture is what architecture seems to me to be about, on one hand. But it is also the other aspect of the homophone. It represents our culture. Bad architecture reflects bad culture. Good architecture reflects good culture. It brings us together as a people, as opposed to driving us apart. And the one thing I've learned, because I really don't know anything, I know how to make films, I hope, but I certainly am not an architectural expert. So I approached this film with that in mind. What does a totally ignorant person like me want to know? And I suppose what I've come away with is that particular thought from these incredibly distinguished people that I was lucky enough to be able to talk to. It's about culture. And good luck to you, is all I can say, because Christ, sorry, I'm going to not use the F word, but our culture is effed up at the moment. And it's not just about building, but how do you bring it back together? Not by creating a ballroom in a park over a macadamized set of greenery, and that's just one tiny bit of the problems. So Eric, why did you commission this film?
Similar question, yeah. Maybe Eric, you can reflect a little bit on your experience working with Jon. You know, how much did you have to talk and kind of explain your ideas about architecture and its meaning before you were able to kind of get to the idea of the film?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think it's a bit vague, but I was aware that we were doing some, kind of important projects socially, and this isn't a film about, a beautiful product. It's about the process, and I think that you could point to many parts. I will pick up one example. That's the bottoming out ceremony. Now, that's something that's so fleeting and so normally forgotten because it comes, those words are spoken, time capsules embedded. But actually, when you think about it, the ceremony of kind of foundation is so critical to civilization, So I go back to the idea of a town and Joseph Rickwood's brilliant book, but his one of the points of his career was working with the archaeologists in Rome around finding the lapis niger, the foundation stone of Rome. When we make places as a culture, we mark those beginnings, it lightly or heavily or whatever, but it's such an important part of the ritual of a ritual of renewal, if you will. It's so critical. I was kind of determined that we should capture that moment. So I asked a few things of Jon that we think about that. We get that permission to take that bit of film. I would say the same thing of other parts of the film. But it's actually not so much to do with the beautiful end product as to kind of record a process of thinking to some extent, but the process of making. And actually, we decided that we'd make 2 films. So there's a second that is more concentrated on some of those more formal aesthetic issues, which we have embarked on, and I hope that Jon is enthused at this point.
I should live so long.
So there's a sequel.
Yeah, well, in some shape or form, yeah.
Okay, I think we should open it out to the floor. If anyone has questions for Eric or any of our panellists, please raise your hand.
Wonderful, Phil. And I just had a quick question really for you, Eric, because you mentioned about your year out in Newcastle. So again, another side of it, I'm a little partial to Newcastle, but also just to ask, because you mentioned measurement and you mentioned how much that connects to building and linking the ancient through the digital realm in a way, because we are there now. But it's also very much what you do in the city and in the heart of the city as much as anything. So I wanted to come back to Newcastle partly because obviously Ian Nairn always talked about that great train ride through over the castle keep and right into the heart of the city, and also just seeing how the architecture linking its ancient history through into its current urban developments, not always successful, but what happened. And just seeing maybe was that year there's something critical for you in your thinking. Okay.
Yeah, well that year was preceded by 3 years of architectural study. And, I really enjoyed the fact that the architecture school was adjacent to the art school. and the materials store, and the Kurt Schwitter's Merzbar, and being taught by extraordinary figures. Because one thinks about art school. I often think that those fundamental courses that were there, like Mr. L.C. Evarts, who taught us Roman lettering, really at the time seemed very retrospective. It was all about the letters on the base of Trajan's column, and he was the great expert. But then, I run into somebody like Joseph Brickworth again, and many years later, he's designing the headstone for his mother's tomb, and the importance of lettering. I also think that Richard Hamilton would never have got to the point of recreating the large grass without the expertise of the glass department in the art school. So these critical kind of aspects of knowledge that underpin the radical ways of thinking about visual arts or architecture seem to me to do with that kind of conversation, and measurement is just fundamentally part of it. So, if you think about those years, you've got the thing that is indelible are the landscapes and the projects that we got set in these incredible places, like the coast, Hadrian's Wall, southwards towards Durham. Yeah, it's Newcastle, and at the time, the other kind of measuring was actually learning from practitioners like Ralph Erskine, who were building what had designed the Byker Wall, and set up an office on the site that was about consultation and conversation. Those lessons, which are about the palpable, seem to me to be incredibly important and would be exemplified, I think, by that relationship between visual arts and architecture at Newcastle. So it's indelible for me. It was the most fantastic, to answer your question. 4 years, 1 year applying actually Parker Morris standards and putting bathrooms in the old extensions at the back of working in Benwell, Elzig, working with the sociology department, live like hell in terms of the palpable foundations, which I think are critical. So I'm a big addict.
Discussion. I guess I want to pick up one comment that was made during the film. How can cities be for the citizens? And you suggested that somehow planners should be given that responsibility of, in a way, saving the commons, making cities somehow for the life of the city. Well, I think we all know we are in a zone of rampant late capitalism, in which I think for a lot of the time one feels one is the victim of the city rather than the enjoyer of the city. And I'm wondering if you could say more, or the panel could say more about how we can achieve that, making cities for the citizens.
I would just start by, I've singled out the planners, but actually it seems to me it's the politicians, and there's a spirit that needs to be active or activated in order that it doesn't get, because you get to continental cities, and actually there is a sense of rigor mortis because the authorities and the rule book are so tight, you're not going to get a lot of excitement. But the balance and the process of consultation and discussion seem to me to be incredibly important. So that democratic process of voting for things, for having a voice, and therefore the political dimension of urban thinking and urban design, that is given voice by something like the regulations of planning, and its ability to work with the political will to formulate good places is just critical. So that's very, I don't know there's an ideal, there isn't an ideal, because the cycles, we've been working long enough to see it, these kind of, there are abuses that, should we say, that you can see happening. I think the critical difference is, London is kind of a really good case study, because it's a city of many cities, and two particularly, the city of Westminster and the city of London. And for whatever we might think, I think the difference is incredibly interesting. That is to say, one is mercantile, and one is a seat of the political voice. And you, as a practitioner, you really need to have a kind of passport to work between those two. And I think that's incredibly important and good. You take an idea that you might have implemented in one, and it's absurd in the other, because the cultural roots of these two places are so different. I think there's a very interesting case study there in terms of permanence, of change, of respect, continuity, and so I think we need to be alert to what a city needs as well to prosper. And so it's a very complex question, Anthony, but I do think it's a political one at the beginning.
Sorry, John.
No, go on.
I think you're more important tonight.
No.
Very briefly, I think the notion of the public, and I mean, looking at, again, the history of the city, going back to, as you say, Eric, the historic meeting places, the Agora, the Forum, and so on. They were places where people naturally came together through necessity, not least to buy food originally, but then they became places, heterogeneous spaces, where people came as equals to debate, to learn news, to gossip, to, in the case of Athens, to vote in the middle of the market. And I think, again, now that really goes back to the essence of the question I was trying to put earlier. I feel that the very notion of the public is disappearing, because we're engaging with each other online, and online is literally the opposite of public space. And I think as architects we have an incredibly urgent duty to make the case for what the public is. And it's a space where anyone can go, and anyone, within sort of criminal boundaries, as it were, can do anything. And we see moments of it, usually during demonstrations now, occasionally through celebrations, when you really feel the body politic still exists. And I think we have to fight for more and more of those spaces. And it's not just the big, dramatic Trafalgar Square-y ones, it's also the meeting places, the pubs, the churches, the kind of youth clubs, the places where you can just get out of your house, get off your phone critically, and be in the physical presence of other people. And I don't think there's anything more important to fight for now, because it's literally the last bastion of, again, being human as animals together, before we just disappear down the latest QAnon drainpipe.
I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but the great French director Louis Malle was asked several times over the years what he thought was the hardest thing he could do in his career and how had he managed to overcome it. And as I understand it, I wasn't there, he answered by saying he never overcame it, but it was the constant search for simplicity. And that strikes me as the answer to your question, which is architects, builders, planners, politicians should be looking for simplicity, because out of simplicity comes humanity, and that's what unites the citizen to the city. And the worst things, the worst excrescences of terrible architecture are where we lose sight of humanity and of scale. And I'm thinking of scale in so many different ways, whether it's an Angel of the North with its enormous scale, but it reminds us of who we are, or whether it's the sculptures on the beach, which remind us of who we are, and whether it's your buildings, which, although sometimes they can be very big, as I see it, always remind us of our place as human beings. And that, as a completely lay person, is seek simplicity, and out of simplicity comes humanity.
I just quickly wanted to speak up in defence of the City of London, because of what you just said, and maybe the planners in the city, because I'm not involved myself in this space, it's something that I've seen as an observer. But there's something now that we call groundage, and when you go for planning application for something very large, like for example, 22 Bishopsgate in the city, my understanding is that we now have a lot of extra space at ground level for the people to walk through. When you look back at Bishopsgate Road 20 years ago, it was just a tunnel, and you couldn't, apart from the big intersections, you couldn't go anywhere. Now with the new developments, and I think there has been a bit of quid pro quo in terms of extra space up top maybe, but the planners wanted some space to be given back to the people for everybody to walk through. So those developments, we actually have gotten it back. And then in addition, also as we saw in the film, there are now quite a few more roof terraces that are public in the city that we never had before. So there is definitely an understanding that it's a good thing to have and people want to go for it. There's always more to do, but I think at least it's not that nothing happens, because some people are working towards it.
To learning and teaching the importance of that and developing architectural culture of it, and perhaps also bringing to Caro. I wondered if, to Caro, you and Eric both discuss how important, running a studio, running a practice, and teaching at the same time is to kind of generating that culture, and specifically thinking about kind of how you develop your briefs, how you work with students, the dialogue that you talked about, whether it's not always perhaps one way, not always the kind of the teacher leading the student, but whether ideas actually emerge through your interactions with students, which you then kind of take back into practice. And Eric, I guess now that you don't teach anymore, is that something that is missing, or have you, I think as Takara was perhaps alluding to earlier, is that something that you've managed to recreate in some way within the practice, given its scale? So just kind of interrogate a little bit more the intersection between being a teacher and being an architect.
Well, I can't talk about Eric's office, but I think just this question about publicness is interesting in terms of teaching. We've been discussing about the idea of commons for the last 3-4 years in our unit, and I learned so much more from students and guest speakers, younger, more kind of active doers in a way. And this idea of working with empty buildings, which in this film there's conversation about skyscrapers, but there are more and more empty buildings in London and in wider Greater London, and we find that as incredible opportunity, discussing with students about reoccupying those buildings, reusing them in a very kind of activist kind of ways to create new commons. Like 2 years ago we looked at Sutton High Street, which is kind of really quite struggling commercially, converting a former BHS warehouse into a cultural workspace, commons, and freely accessible spaces. I think all of those conversations came from our actual clients in our practice, but also like ideas from students, looking at younger architects kind of working very actively in those kind of situations. So I'm quite hopeful that this kind of crisis, climate, but also capitalism crisis, is bringing ideas that are very positive. So I learn a lot by teaching. I don't know if this is answering the question, but it's really interesting energy to receive from the dialogue with the students.
Yeah, no, I'd echo that because I talked about the debt intellectually, that one owed to those years of teaching. That's a two-way process, and well, a complex and interesting process. I think towards the end of my teaching years, running that studio about making things, I think of the many students who went through, but Tom Emerson, David Grandorge. It was a huge learning and reciprocal kind of process. It's a privilege to teach eager, bright people. It's a dialogue, and it's very much a two-way street. So one's learning, and I think that ethos is something that continues, into practice, in the way we practice.
Yeah, certainly I recognise the eagerness and the optimism that students can bring sometimes when we're, feeling pessimistic about the situation. Being in the studio and learning, from people who are still kind of very much at the beginning of their careers. It just feels really exciting. Yeah. Do we have any last questions or any? Aha, we do. Caroline.
I spend my life trying to help people who commission buildings, so clients, to have the confidence to commission buildings from architects who are capable of creating excellence. And I think teaching architects is one thing, but architecture isn't just something which is done in isolation. It's done with a whole group of people, and actually it's really dependent on the people who are on the client side and who are actually doing the commissioning. And what I'm seeing out there in the big wide world is that clients, commissioners don't know enough about architecture, are scared of architecture, and frankly find it very difficult to understand architecture and therefore to commission good architecture, to have the confidence to commission good architecture. So I actually don't think teaching architects architecture is enough. And I just wonder whether anyone on the panel has any thoughts about that. Thank you.
And I think it's really interesting that actually now there is a RIBA prize for the best client of the year as well as the best architect, which is, you can't get a good building without a good client. I weirdly, earlier today at my Pilates class, just randomly said to my fellow Pilates victims, can you name 3 famous architects? Guess what? They couldn't. There's an astonishing gap between what we in this room do and the rest of the world. I mean, how many times have you switched on the telly and say, amazing new building built on the South Bank, it's a new arts complex, it's blah, 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 and you go, who's the architect? Who's the architect? You're going to mention the architect? Oh, you're not going to mention the architect. They're often not even mentioned. It's just the weirdest thing. So I think that's a hugely important thing you've brought up. We need also to sort of, we do talk in language. It's very interesting, of course all specialisms do, but I was reflecting when watching Jon's wonderful film for the umpteenth time, this is literally my baby food talk. It's like, mummy putting another spoon of, Heinz chocolate pudding into me. It's so familiar, this way of talking, but it's not normal language at all. So it sounds like you were on the path to creating a very important bridge, but I think it's critical, really critical, because we could be so much more useful to society and to politicians if they knew what the hell we did. I mean, there's something incredibly powerful about the architectural mind, which goes way beyond designing buildings. It is what Eric said, it's about the connective brain, seeing how lots and lots of different things are joined together and not being scared to think big, but in a connected, networky way. Sorry, I can talk forever, but, you know, brilliant question, I think.
I think we're coming to the end of our discussion. I wanted to just put it back to you, Eric. Do you have any kind of closing remarks to kind of neatly sum up our evening?
Well, I think it's really only the second time I've seen it. I've seen it in bits, so I'm amazed by your perseverance. But I wanted to just thank Jon and the team. Making a film is an extraordinary thing, you know, because it's in its own right is a collective. You've got, you know, directors, producers, you know, you've got camera, you've got editing, you've got so many skills that need to be brought together under the umbrella of direction. I would just like to pay my respects to the process of making a film, the beautiful, you know, the simple, the photography. It's amazing to see it at this big scale, you know, but the character, it's like portrait painting. It's an extraordinary skill. The sound was amazing. I was very loud. It was very clear. I heard things I hadn't heard before here, you know. So I mean, but anyway, just to the amazing art of filmmaking. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. But in answer to what that lady said, you were, of course, the perfect client. So thank you.